Well, welcome to the session this evening. You're going to have me tonight, and we are going to deal with important concepts within Christianity and concepts that are complex because of all the baggage they carry with them over the history of Christianity and interpretation. And it's difficult for all of us, even me, to put my mind around all of the baggage to kind of clarify and to bring it down into a real clarity of understanding. Let me try to illustrate that with what I mean. For most of my life, and I love history, my historical focus was east. You know, the pilgrims landing on the East Coast, moving up and down the East Coast, moving west, until I got to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And when I got to Albuquerque, New Mexico, all of a sudden, I had to make a dynamic shift because the conquistadores were here and had gone before we had arrivals on the East Coast. And that was difficult for me to make that shift and to begin thinking in an entirely different way and seeing my life, which was, interestingly enough, is that I grew up in southeastern Colorado that still had the old Hispanic land grants, you know, so it was there. I just missed that. And so it took me a while to really kind of get around and see that the history of this country with regards to immigrants coming in recently, and of course being near the Pueblos and loving to go out on the Dene Reservation, but being confronted out there, you know, the people had been here long before the conquistadores, and they wanted us to know that. And that, again, was a piece that I kind of knew, but hadn't incorporated emotionally. I say that because down through history, we have traditional teachings, hi Sarah, regarding sin and salvation. And those are the two issues that we're going to deal with tonight. The first session, we're going to talk about sin. And I want you all to take out a piece of paper and write down your three, no. We're going to talk about sin, and then we're going to talk about that really loaded term, salvation. Both of these terms, it's important for us as Christians to have some clarity, not only with regards to our conversation within Christendom, with those who have a variety of different understandings and perspectives, but also with regards to our conversations here on the campus with our tri-faith partners. It is crucial that we have a clarity of understanding with regards to what we mean by those terms. I do not expect you all to believe what I believe, and that's what I continually say, and I want to say it again. I really invite your pushback, your questions, and your perspectives. We just need to hear that. But let's take a look at sin. Let's just sin, okay? Let's get right into it. Like Martin Luther once said, just love God and sin boldly. So here we go. We're going to love God and sin boldly. As John said last week, in our Hebrew and New Testament, sin is expressed, the term is often loosely expressed, but it's expressed as missing the mark. And I think we all kind of understand that in terms of our relationships, but we really, what does that mean? Missing what mark? What's the mark? What is the objective? What is the goal? Well, I think we see that very clearly in the teachings of Jesus. The mark, love God, love neighbor, love self. And I want to say something right off, is that I do not subscribe, and I'll be anxious to get some feedback from those who understand this a little better than I do. I don't think you have to love yourself before you can love someone else. I think that these things are intertwined and integral. One of the things that I think is also important for us is to think about love not as it is so defined in our culture with regards to this emotional, sexual attachment to things and people and whatever, but to think about the depths of what love means with regards to really seeing the other as other, appreciating, affirming, all of those things that love is also essential in terms of our understanding of our relationship with God. God needs to be God. And there are those expressions where it's hard for us to acknowledge that, to let that be, and we want to create God in an image that's comfortable for us. And so if we are to love God, we really need to allow God to be God and to explore what that energy, what that dimension is in our relationship. Just as if to love you, it's important for me to listen, to understand, to affirm, to honor you. Not to try to create you in my image, but to find that connection of where we honor one another. Okay? So, let's then move on with this. If we kind of agree, the plumb line, Amos uses the idea of the plumb line. You measure truth against a plumb line. And for those of you who do not know what that is, in masonry or in some framing, you take a string and you hang it up high and you put a weight on the bottom of it, and as it drops down and gravity then pulls it straight down, that's straight. That is what everything is measured by. If it's not lined up with the plumb line, it's out of level. It's out of being straight. Anyway, so the plumb line for us with regards to sin and how the mark is to love God, love neighbor, and love self. I also want to remind us that last week I talked extensively about this divine environment, that whenever we evaluate our theology, whenever we evaluate our relationships with one another, I want us to think about it in terms of this divine environment in which Jesus is constantly reminding us that it is the essence of God's acceptance and love, that it's critical and crucial, and the love of those who are on the periphery of society, who are considered not valuable, who are considered outcasts, who are considered unworthy. That it is crucial for our focus to be upon how that love is important for our growth as we love, that our growth is intricately connected with the loving others. The aspect of sin that probably is the widest understanding in both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is seen in terms of broken relationship. When there is a broken relationship, whether that's between us or God, between us and one another, or an internal brokenness, there is then in that brokenness sin. One of the examples has to do with regards to the story of Moses. Here we have Moses has made this trek back to Egypt. In a series and a period of time, he has gained the trust of some of the Israelites that were there. And through a sequencing of events, is able to convince them that it's okay to leave. And I don't want to get into all the dynamics of that because I don't know. All I know is that somewhere along the line, he convinced them to leave, and they went with him. And in doing so, there was developing a trust that God was with them, and God would not abandon them, and that God went before them by day, pillar of fire, and at night by the smoke, affirming that God was with them, and they trusted that. Now then, as they were journeying along, they ran into all kinds of conflict, difficulties of traveling in the desert, in the wilderness, of which they did not have the resources to deal with that. And in whatever way, and I'm not going to answer the questions for geologists or whatever, these were provided. They ate, they were able to find springs of water, and they drank, and they were able to have the basic necessities of life in their journey. But they didn't have the goodies that they had kind of anticipated. So they get to a place where Moses is up on a mountain. He's having this conference with God, debating with God about how many commandments. You know, you've heard that story that he comes back and he says, well, the good news is that I got God down from 100 to 10. The bad news is that adultery is still one of the 10. This scene of Moses and God up on the mountain working through these 10. And the people are anxious because their leader is gone. They are remembering what they have been through. And then, you know, the past seems better than what it was. I don't know how many of you know the name Dizzy Dean. He was a pitcher in the 30s and a broadcaster. And one of the lines that I'll never forget, he would say, the older I get, the better I was. Well, I resonate with that, but that's kind of the way it was with the Israelites out in the desert. You know, as they looked back, it got better than what it was. Yes, they were in slavery. Yes, they were oppressed, but there was food and there was water, and there wasn't all of this traveling around and wandering around in the desert. So they got fed up, and they thought, let's get another god. This was not working so well. And so they convinced Aaron to, bring together, and they formed this calf of which they were now going to give their allegiance to. That's brokenness. They broke the trust. They broke the relationship. They broke the relationship with God. And that was also part of the undoing of breaking the relationship with one another. One of the pieces of this, no, I'm going to go on. I can, you know, people who have been with me before, I can go down rabbit holes, and I'm going to really try not to do that. One of the passages of Scripture that I want us to look at tonight with regards to taking a look at this idea of sin is one that we may not think about as the passage to look at first, but it is the one about the rich man and Lazarus. Recall that story, that parable. And one of the things that I want to also say again and again and again, last week John talked about the integration of theos and mythos. We really need to be thinking when we're approaching the text about the story within the story. There is a story that conveys a message, but there's always that story within the story that conveys the truth, as we are seeking to discover that. So here we have this story, a rich man, and Jesus, if this, and I assume that this is a parable of Jesus, he sets it up in such a way that the people of the time would understand, and their heads would already be headed down a trail, a pathway. He said, here is this rich man. He was dressed in purple, which was the finery of the time, fine linen. He feasted sumptuously. Well, mostly at the time of Jesus, most people were not feasting sumptuously. And one of the things that is associated with that in so much of the time is that that would be a sign of righteousness. That evidently this person who has all of these outward signs must be a very righteous person. Okay? Now, it's important in this text. This is probably one, I think it's one of the only ones. John maybe have, help me with this if there's others. I think this is the only parable where Jesus names a participant. He gives the name to Lazarus, which right off is signifying a moment of honor and respect. And who is it that gets designated with this name of honor and respect? It's Lazarus, covered with sores, longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. So it's kind of like looking east, and all of a sudden you have to look another direction. Here, the hearers are kind of turned upside down. What do you mean? Here is this person who we would consider outcast, a reject, not valuable, not worthy, must have done something wrong to be in this kind of a condition and situation, and he is named. And in being named, we go on with the story. So now we have the rich man and we have Lazarus. They both died. And the rich man was carried away, or the poor man was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. Now that's an important piece, because I have often heard this text preached that he went to heaven and was with God. Text doesn't say that. We have to put this in the time that it was told. There were some who looked and accepted afterlife. A lot didn't. and at death went to the place of the dead, the abode of the dead. Okay? So here he goes to be, and he's in relationship, close relationship with Abraham. And the rich man dies, and he is buried, which is an interesting concept there that we won't get into the exegesis of this passage all the way. And he is in Hades, which tells us right away that this story now, Luke has converted it a bit. He's telling it to the Greek audience, because in the Jewish audience that would be Sheol, and for the Greeks it's Hades, named after the god of the underworld. Okay? So he is in Hades, and he is being tormented, and he looks up and he sees Abraham. And he says, he's far away with Lazarus, and here is probably one of the real clinchers of this passage. I'll give you a sign ahead of time. He says, he looks up, saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He calls out, he says, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send that slave boy down here with a drink of water for me." Get that? Do you get why he's down there? Why he is apart? I mean, why there is this distancing? Why there is this unbelievable distance between this rich man and Lazarus? Because even in his agony, Jesus is saying he cannot see Lazarus as a person of value and worth. Send that boy down here to give me a drink. Now, I don't know what might be the rest of the story, that rest of the story. I often speculate, I wonder, if we were to think about the parable of the prodigal son, I don't like that term, I don't. The lost son, when the lost son comes to his senses, he says to himself, "I have nothing to take back to my father, but I can go back and serve." Now, what might be in this parable if the rich man would have said, "May I come across and serve Lazarus"? That would have been the reunification of the brokenness. But it didn't happen. But that's the message, I think, is underneath this story, is that this depiction of this rich man is that he sees himself quite involved in the culture. I mean, it is culture to look down upon anyone who would be in the position of Lazarus. And for him to not be able to continue to see that here as a human being is the sin. Not willing to see this human being is the brokenness. That is the sin. That's what we need to deal with, is that how do we look at one another? To get to some conversation, I want to tell two stories, because I also think in our day and age, we need to think about this in terms of not only our relationship with one another, but in terms of our relationship to our environment. So I want to tell two stories that reflect what I mean by this. We could get into all kinds of intellectual pursuits about sin. I'm glad to do that. Its derivation and all that kind of things. But let's just take a look and listen to these two stories. The first one occurred when I was a pastor in Loveland, Colorado. One evening, I happened to be in the church when there was a choir rehearsal. I have no idea why I was there because I can't sing. And everybody knew that. So we know I wasn't there to have anything to do with the singing part. But I was there, and unbeknownst to me, one of the ladies in the congregation had invited a woman in the community who sang in Loveland, who sang in Fort Collins, had a beautiful voice to sing. And we were talking, I was talking to someone, and in she came down the center aisle, and she got about here, but there's the pews, and stopped. And right there was the choir director's music stand. And she stopped. And she said, "Is there something in front of me?" And, turned around, the choir director went over, moved the stand, and she proceeded on in to discover she was blind. That she had had a disease as a young girl that had affected her optic nerve, and it was no longer functioning, no longer there. She was not able to see. Now, her other senses had developed very well. Later, in conversation with her, because as she experienced the welcomeness of that congregation, began to come and participate, and was in a conversation, she told me she had been away from the church for about 5 years, and the only reason she had come the first time to sing was because her good friend had pestered her. Because the church she grew up in had finally cast her out. She had to be demonic, because if she had faith as a mustard seed, she would be able to see. The elders had prayed over her. The elders had anointed her. And yet that disease did not get turned around. And so there was something wrong with her. Can you imagine that? That's sin at its gravest level. The other story virtually is very simple. It comes from a bluegrass song. I think I've got the words right here. Anyway, it goes something like this. He asks his dad if he would take him back to Muhlenberg County, down the Green River where paradise lay. "I'm sorry, my son, you're too late in asking. Mr. Peabody's coal train just hauled it away." And then it goes on in another line about the largest shovel was brought in by the coal companies that stripped off the timber and devastated the land, all in the name of the progress of man. I think we need to consider that as well in terms of the relationship, not only of how we relate to one another in wholeness, but we need to be really thinking about how we're relating to our earth. We need to be listening carefully to some of our indigenous friends who have talked about Mother Earth and have encouraged us to refine that depth of connection and resolution. I was extremely fortunate. I grew up in a small truck farm in eastern Colorado with my grandparents. Pop had an equivalent of a fourth grade education, came out of the hollers of Kentucky, and yet was way ahead of himself. I don't know where he had read, where he had gotten this information, but we had a compost pile that was on 3 sides. There were actually cut off telephone poles and barnwood. I mean, and this thing stood up this high. My friend and I loved it because in the wintertime it was warm and we could play in there, and we got smelly in there, but we could play in there, and it was a great fort. But he cared for the soil. I can still see him in the fields in the spring, that earth. rubbing through his fingers. He loved the earth. We need to reconnect with some of that. And sin not only affects the one in which we have pushed away, it affects us. It reduces our humanity. Whether it is a person of a different color, a different ethnicity, a different sexual orientation, or even someone who does not see life as I see it. It affects me when I push them away. And so that's the reason I think that it is critical and crucial as Christians that we struggle with what does sin mean, and how might we find resolution, forgiveness, but reunification of that which is broken. Does that make sense? I'd like for you to take some time and talk around your tables now for about 10 minutes or so, and just talk a little bit about, you can join anybody, or I'll even talk with you. First of all, the question that I would like for us to raise each time is, what I said, what question does that, what arises out of the question? And then the other part of the conversation is, what is important in your life journey that needs to be healed? Okay? Let's go on to the next topic, salvation. And one of the things that I will have to rein myself in on is that I can get very cynical about salvation. And I will try not to do that because salvation has been used to beat people over the head for centuries. It has been used as a way to demean, to somewhat destroy. It has been used as a way to distance and to eliminate people because of how we viewed and related to the term salvation. I'm going to, and I can't in 40 minutes go through all of the baggage. I mean, I think you all are aware of what baggage you are aware of and carry with you with regards to perception of salvation that doesn't fit. Okay? It just doesn't fit for you. And I think that's the bottom line as we begin to talk about what salvation is to sort out what is it in terms of our understanding of God's grace, of God's love, of God's care, of all the environment of everyone, encouraging us to love and care for everyone, and loving ourselves. And I was in a conversation over here because I hope you all didn't hear me say with regards to you can't love yourself that that's a black and a white, because it is important for all of us to develop that which is within us. And so I want to begin there with regards to salvation. If, and I, this is not a big if for me, but let's just say if the scientists are correct and our ancestor is a common cell, that over billions of years divided, subdivided, and with regards to all of the information in the chromosomes and the DNA that I don't understand, but carries with it the information that tells these various cells how they connect and disconnect and all that sort of thing to come to where we are today. Okay? I believe, and I think that there are others. First of all, there are those cosmologists, those scientists, who are certain that there are various codes embedded within the cell that are consistent down through creation and down through time and down through the evolutionary process. There are those, and I really believe that one of the pieces that's embedded is love. That embedded in the original cell is I don't even want to use the formula. In fact, I don't even have the right word, is love. And so that as the evolutionary process takes place, this essence of what we know and try to define and experience of love is present. And that part of our journey is discovering and giving that love permission to grow and to be shared and to be involved in the lives of ourselves and the lives of others. Which brings me to an interpretation of salvation that works for me. It may not work for you, and that's okay. You know, we talk about that. That's okay. It doesn't have to work for you. But I think that the term that is used, "Are you saved?" is absolutely blasphemous. And particularly the way it has used to delineate who is in and who's out, who's important, who's unimportant, who's faithful, who is not faithful. The journey of salvation is to discover we're not alone and that we are deeply loved. That we are not alone seems to be, to me, to be the message that continually comes through our scripture and comes through so many experiences. How do we explain someone who is ripped out of their culture as a very proud and magnificent human being, forced into a slave ship, and survive with an inner strength and an inner sense, I'm going to make it? Now, whether they were able to verbalize they were not alone or not, I do not know. All I know is that I think that somewhere there was a sense of companionship, that they weren't alone. When you are ripped out of centuries-old traditional lands and forced to march 1,000 miles to Oklahoma. I know some of you may like Oklahoma, but to Oklahoma. How do you survive unless there is that internal sense you're not alone? There is a strength and there is a presence that is there that will not abandon us. That is salvation. Important parts of that is that, first of all, I don't believe that salvation is a belief statement. Okay? There are a lot of belief statements that are given that if you believe this, believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and you accept him as your personal Lord and Savior, which I think has some important elements to it. It is not going to save you. That's not what saves us. And salvation, and this is my cynicism, salvation is not that ticket to dance down through the pearly gates on golden streets to that great banquet. Salvation is that strength to live life. Jesus, well, I think here's one of the places, I have a lot of trouble with John in the Gospels, but here's one of the places I think that John absolutely got it right when he said that, when he says that Jesus report, I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. Two of the parables that I find highly significant, one depends on whether it's Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and they happened all three to be in this parable in all three, is the rich or the young or the ruler who comes and says, good teacher, and we go through that. There's only one who is good, and that's God alone, which goes right back to the Shema. I mean, Jesus is very accurate with that. And he wants to know, what must I do to have eternal life? That's the question. And at the end of that, he is not able to embrace all of life. He has done the laws, but he is not able to do part of what we talked about before. He's not able to let go of his idol, his wealth, his position, his property, to share his life with another. Now, I don't think Jesus wanted him to become impoverished. I mean, what good is that in terms of this story within the story? Why focus on that? What is the point there is, are you willing to give up your faith and trust in this to trust being able to love another? The other is the lawyer. The lawyer comes and he asks the question. And Jesus, of course, now he knows that the lawyer knows the answer. I mean, that's his profession. That's his task in life. And so he says to this lawyer, how do you read? And the lawyer says, very simple, love God, love neighbor, love self. And Jesus says, you have answered correctly, go and live. This piece about living life abundantly is critical. And salvation, in my mind, is knowing that in the dark night of the soul, we're not alone. To carry that parable on just a little bit, then, of course, he wants to justify himself. And again, he thinks he knows the answer because a part of that answer is that your neighbor is an Israelite. And Jesus turns that on its head. And he gives this story of a despised Samaritan, one who the lawyer would not take kindly to at all, and he tells this story, and he puts the lawyer in a bind. He then says, and who showed mercy to the one who was beside the road? And the lawyer, you can almost see him biting his tongue, says, well, I suppose it was the Samaritan. And then Jesus says to the lawyer, you go and do likewise. The question is asked, what must I do to live? You must give up your bias and prejudice and go and follow that one. Live with the confidence that you can do that. For me, a mantra of salvation, and I haven't always liked using this passage because you use it at every funeral. It seems like everybody wants the 23rd Psalm. But I like it even in the King James because it's got this poetic, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Take this cup from me. And yet there is a sense that God is with Jesus. Even in that, my God, why have you forsaken me? We all resonate with those at times in our life. Maybe not to that extreme, but we resonate with that sense within us, am I alone in this journey? Does anyone out there understand what's going on? That salvation is that awareness that says, I know. I know. And I think that's one of the important places of the church, for us to surround one another, so that when we may not feel like we know, there are those holding us up, so that we know we're not alone. But that the salvation of the church, our salvation, my salvation, is that inner sense. I have a strength and I have a power that is beyond me. And I'm not alone. One story, and this is a family story. The kids were about 10 and 11. When we lived in Colorado, we had gone with families camping. It was about a 2 or 3 mile hike up to this flat area west of Nederland. And so then we moved to Omaha, and they had been quite young then, so they were about 10 and 12, and they wanted to go back up there backpacking. Well, we got into the parking lot, and all of a sudden I realized we were supposed to have a permit. Didn't have to have a permit years before. We had to have a permit. Got a permit. And then to get to the first campground where we had anticipated staying, it was closed off for environmental reasons. It had been overcamped, which meant that we then had to go up over a pass, which we had to go, it was early enough in the year, we had to go across a snow field, down the other side, across an icy field, down into a valley. And we did it. We got into camp. We set up the tents, got the backpacks up high in the trees, and decided we would just take a nap before dinner. We woke up the next morning. I had always struggled with that. Why did I do that? Why did I not turn around and go back to the car and go someplace else? Why did I put my family and my kids through that? It was 6 weeks ago. My daughter and I were having coffee, and for whatever reason, I went back to that, and I mentioned it to her. She said, "Dad, that was the greatest thing that ever happened." She said, "When I run into a difficulty in life, I know I can make it, because I know I have a strength and I know you're there." I think that's salvation. When we know that we're not alone.
We will see you all again next week. Have a good week. Have a blessed week.